G'day guys, welcome to this episode of the Goss. I hope you guys are all surviving well. Wherever you are in the world, we are still in lockdown down under here in Australia, and this is the second episode where I am recording it via Zoom with my old man, with my father. So, today is an episode chock-a-block full of content. It is about an hour and 20 minutes long. If you want the full episode, remember to get access to that, you need to either be signed up to the premium podcast at aussieenglish.com.au, which gives you access to all of the downloads for the podcast episodes, the MP3s, the PDF files, the full transcripts, as well as the transcript player so that you can read and listen at the same time. Or you need to be signed up for the Academy, where you'll have access to the premium podcast, as well as hundreds of other courses that are related to Australia, Australian culture, the expression courses, everything like that. Okay, so those are for all the people who want the podcast, as well as all of that bonus content to work on their English. So that's how you can get access to all of the full episodes for the Goss, including today's. Now today, guys, we chat about a multitude of different topics, a plethora of different subjects. We talk about 7 new species of Australia's colourful dancing peacock spiders. We talk about Tasmanian devils and why you would not want to be a baby Tasmanian devil in the month of April. We talk about violence and alcohol in Australia and what a coward punch is. We also cover the earliest known use of the F word, of the F-bomb, of the word F-U-C-K in English. And then lastly, we cover a few interesting topics on COVID, on the pandemic, and sort of sum that up. Anyway, guys, with that aside, let's get into today's episode. Give a big nudge to that kookaburra, and let's begin. Well, let's just get into it then. What have you been doing in lockup, Dad? How's it all going? What's the goss? What's going on?
The goss? Well, it's been raining for 3 days. So the last couple of days have been good, but I was hoping to get out in the garden, which I eventually did yesterday. And the rest of the time has just been fiddling around, trying to set up the studio in this office. The trouble is that I need to clean the whole office out and start again. So I'm just constantly shuffling bits around.
Yeah.
And I've just started recording a couple of videos. I was shooting the moon last night, which was good fun.
Yeah, so do you want to talk about that? What was it? The biggest giant moon of the year or something?
Oh, the supermoon. Yeah, supermoon is when the moon is as close as it gets in its orbit to Earth.
So why does it change its distance from Earth, if you want to explain
because
that?
it's not a circular orbit. It's slightly oval. It's not hugely oval, but otherwise we would notice a significant difference. I think it's only about a 5% difference in size between the smallest the moon looks and the largest. So to the naked eye, you couldn't tell. So.
Yes. And that's why we have things like king tides and everything, although that's paired with the sun, I take it too.
Yeah, that's when those king tides are when we get the moon closest to the Earth and the line up where you got full moons, where you got the moon, the sun and the Earth are all in a line. And so you get this the gravitational forces pulling in the same direction. So
it's almost synergistic, right? It's really bizarre.
Yes.
When I remember learning from geology that the moon pulls the water towards it using gravity, obviously, but that you have an equal and opposite effect on the other side of the Earth, so that the tide is effectively happening on the side closest to the moon and the side furthest
stretched
away. Yeah. How does that work? Do you know much about how that effect works? That you have the water being pulled and almost, I don't know if you would say pushed, but it goes in the opposite direction.
I'm not sure. I'm not a hydrophysicist, so I couldn't tell you
that was always mind blowing when I was doing geology and learning about that stuff. It's always like, what the hell?
Yeah. But that's the sort of global tidal effect. But then the local tides are so much affected by the local geography. With currents and so on. So otherwise, everybody around the world would have high tide and low tide at the same time.
Yeah, we have those weird situations like within Port Phillip Bay where the tide is an hour or two delayed because of the opening of the bay is very small and the water takes a long time to come in and then go out.
Right. Yeah, the tides in Melbourne are about 2 hours, I think, different from the tides at Port Phillip Heads.
Yeah, too funny. What else was I going to mention? There was something else I wanted to mention before we got into it, but I've forgotten
It's
what it was
totally
going to
gone. You'll
be.
think of it in 20 minutes.
Oh, gardening in Australia.
Yeah.
It's something that we take for granted and just assume, oh, everyone does that. But this is another one of those things where with Kel, when I talk to her about life in Brazil, she's like, that's not a thing. Like, I
No.
mean, it probably is a thing for some people, but it's not as common as it
Yeah.
is here, where you have almost every house has a garden, right? Maybe if you have an
Mm.
apartment, you don't have a garden, but the average person who expects to build a house expects to probably have a front yard, a backyard, and they'll have a garden generally in both. Do you want to
Yeah.
talk about that and Australian culture a little bit?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, Australian sort of at least middle class culture has always grown up with this, certainly for the last century, of everybody wants their quarter acre block with a house on it, and the front yard, the backyard, and the barbecue and the flowers and the trees and everything as part of that environment. The irony is that we tend to create suburban areas by cutting down a whole lot of nature, building housing development, and then trying to put nature back again.
And populating it with stuff that's not native, right?
Yeah, yeah, in many cases, yeah.
Has that changed throughout your lifetime, though, that in terms of what people do in their gardens, with their gardens, the size of them, the plants they have in them?
Yeah, I think the sort of Australian natives were just unheard of almost when I was a child. It was sort of just the sort of weirdo hippie gardeners that might have the Australian natives or indigenous plants in them. Now, yeah, obviously some large trees were remnant, and so we had large eucalypts and banksias and acacias and things that people just had in their gardens, but not too many people planted them. And everything was sort of much more English garden, the
Yeah.
English cottage gardens with lines of rose bushes and those sort of things. So,
And you still see those houses around the place. You go for a walk in any of the
yeah,
old
yeah,
suburbs, especially closer to the city, there tends to be less native stuff and more of that sort of British style
yeah,
gardens.
exactly. But now I think, certainly for the last 30 or 40 years, I think many people have realised that it in fact costs us a lot of water to
Mm-hmm.
keep those European gardens, because those plants are used to having constant water supply, whereas we have obviously a much drier summer. And if you're putting in native plants, particularly those that are indigenous to the area or from similar climatic areas, then they can survive a lot longer without being watered over summer.
Well, and especially it's a big thing if you enjoy native wildlife too, right?
Yeah, yeah, and if you want birds and reptiles and even butterflies and things like that to be around, then butterflies in particular, they'll feed on a lot of things, but they're very specific to particular plants to breed on, because their caterpillars will often be very specific. So it helps if you want native animals, as you say, to have native plants. And one of the
Yeah.
other differences too, that having spent a lot of time in North America, but North American gardens and Australian gardens are very different. North America and Europe similarly, because typically our die-off period for grass, as an example, and grasses are typically used as the ground cover in most gardens, um, then our die-off period for grass is summer, because
Mm.
it just gets hot and dry. Whereas in North America and Europe, their die-off period is winter, because they're covered in snow. And so it's this weird difference of, people sort of, pop up in spring and go, oh, look, the grass has started to grow. And for us, the grass starts to grow in autumn. So,
Well, learning so much about, the colonization of Australia and the first
yeah.
Europeans to come here, it is so interesting to hear their take on the Australian bush. And that I think one example was there was a Scottish painter who was brought over as a convict, and it took him, or the painting of Australian wildernesses, it took 20 years before people started getting the colors right, because they were painting them with really vibrant colors that they were
Yes.
used to using for landscapes back in Britain, Great Britain. So those early Australian paintings that you see of the landscape, they're way too vibrant, and it took them a long
Yeah.
time to get
Yeah.
used to the dull greens and greys and reds and everything, right, of the eucalypts.
Yeah, and particularly for painters, even later on, painters who were trained in the European style of landscape painting, One of the most famous Australian early landscape painters was Eugene von Gerard, who obviously by the name is European. And he trained in Europe. And when he came to Australia, he did some of the most beautiful landscape paintings of the sort of mid-19th century. But when you have a close look at it, the shapes of the trees and the leaves and things, even though he is painting Australian forests with eucalypts in them, they individually, the bits and pieces look like Europeans because that's how he was trained to paint.
Yeah.
And so he wasn't painting as an exact picture of what he saw. He was painting what he felt, and what he felt was a European forest. So you're right, it was colours, but it was also just the feel. The shapes of the trees are just sort of wrong in some cases.
Well, and they would have been so shocked, right? Because the plants in the northern hemisphere, I've forgotten the scientific term, drop their leaves, right? So except for maybe pine trees, you have deciduous plants that all drop their leaves during winter because it's so cold that they would otherwise freeze. There's not much light
They'd
anyway.
Freeze, or they would catch so much snow that the tree would end up collapsing.
Yeah, but when they got to Australia, I don't think we have any deciduous trees, right? Especially not the main
very
ones.
Few.
The eucalypts and everything keep their leaves year round. And one of the things in Fatal Shore was that he said and mentioned, I was like, wow, that is kind of shocking, is the fact that the bark of the eucalypts is the stuff that falls off the tree, right? And that would have been so strange for people to first see this bark crinkling up and falling over the branches.
And
but
it's stripping off.
Yeah, but it's such an Australian thing that's one of those big, the image of those sort of, what would you call them? Really sharp inverted teardrop curve shaped leaves from eucalypts as well as that bark.
Exactly.
And the twisted, gnarled branches are something that's very, very Australian. But also how much the convicts and the other people would have thought it was a complete paradise because they would have likely never seen forest like that before, right? Because Britain had effectively been chopped. That all trees and forests were effectively removed. There may have been a few small ones.
Certainly a lot of places, like, particularly up in the Highlands, not the Alps and other high mountain ranges in Europe are too high to have trees. But some of the places like the Highlands of Scotland haven't had trees for 5,000 years. But that's not a climatic thing. People just cut them all down. Because trees were used for building material and for fuel. And the trees grew so slowly there that once they had gone, there's not enough forest around to protect the new growth in the winter that you'll never get it back again without effectively artificially creating forests. They will never come again. And as soon as you deforest, of course, there's erosion of soil, and so there just isn't the soil bank anymore to retain those trees. So it's a weird thing when you look at you go to the Highlands of Scotland, and they're renowned for their beauty of even though it's barren and it's just rocks and small shrubs and herbs and things. But you look at it and go, 5,000 years ago, this would have been forested.
And it would have had bears, wolves, beavers, large deer, all sorts of other, macrofauna.
Some of which are still there, but some the animals that obviously relied on forests just disappeared with them.
Yeah. So how did you go trying to find good news this week? Did you get anything decent that wasn't the C word, which we can leave to the end of the episode?
Not a lot, really. There are a few good stories, but some of those good stories were really just around how people are reacting to the C word. It was a tough one.
So nothing? You don't have anything that's not C related?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head. So I tried very hard this morning to come up with a puppies and kittens story, but I was struggling.
I got a kittens one. 7 new species of Australian colourful dancing peacock spider have been discovered.
I saw that. Yeah, I did see that. Yeah.
And this was it was a paper published by someone working at Museum Victoria where I did my master's and PhD, although I didn't know the person, but it was a young guy. So he's found or described 7 new species of these peacock spiders from mostly from Western Australia. And they shed new light on nature's most colourful critters. And he's been likening them to sort of kittens. So they're very famous, these peacock spiders, if you go on the internet, because they kind of became a meme when people found videos of them doing their displays and dances to attract mates, where they kind of raise up their abdomen that's really colourful.
Yes.
and their, I think, third set of legs at the back, they put up and kind of shake around to get attention.
Third and fourth legs,
Yeah, and so they get they had all these videos going around with them doing the YMCA and stuff like that. And so they're these really cute, charismatic spiders, but they're very tiny, the size of a grain of rice. And so this guy was using like a macro lens.
They're little jumping spiders.
Yeah. Well, that's it. And so I just thought it was really cute. He was saying that one of them that he named is called Maritus constellatus. So what do you reckon constellatus refers to?
Stars.
Yeah, exactly. So the abdomen reminded him of Van Gogh's Starry Night, and so he gave it the species name Constellatus, which I guess is Latin for starry.
Yeah,
but they're very cool. Yeah, as you say, they're little spiders, jumping spiders. They're venomous, harmless to humans, but why? I guess I'll let you go on a riff here. Why are jumping spiders unique in terms of arachnids?
Well, they jump. That's one thing. I mean, most spiders are crawlers. Now these things can crawl too, but they can jump, and they jump huge amounts in comparison with their size. They're a bit like fleas. And that means they're actually you can't be a big jumping spider because your strength to body mass ratio significantly changes as soon as you get big. So
physics
these jumping
says
spiders
no.
Yeah, exactly. You don't see elephants jumping. Yeah.
Well, I think it's something like with fleas, they jump. I can't remember if it was something like 600 Gs is what they experience when they jump.
Yeah.
So when they do their tiny little jumps, 600 G force. The human body, I think, can withstand something like 40 to 50, and then you're dead. And when rockets take off to go into space, I think they experience 1, 2, 3 Gs, if that.
Yeah, about 10, I think, at the most. Yeah.
And that's it. And these fleas are experiencing 600 or more because they're just so. I guess, the power to weight ratio is so high that they just go bing.
Yeah. And, having a different anatomy helps too. With a very small animal with a thick exoskeleton means that they're very well protected from that sort of those forces. Whereas if you're, like us, where our skeleton is inside us, all the soft bits are on the outside, then much more exposed to those sort of force changes.
So why did jumping spiders evolve the ability to jump? Because they don't make webs like other spiders.
No, I think it's just it'll be, and I'm not sure exactly, but I think it's probably a combined evolutionary thing of an escape mechanism and an attack mechanism. It means that you can get away from things. If you're tiny, you're going to be eaten by lots of things.
Yeah.
So I think it's an escape mechanism, but it's also that ambush thing where some bigger ambush spiders, they sort of just dig holes in the ground or sit in the bark of trees and things, and they don't leap out. They just really just grab with their front legs and their mandibles, their mouth parts.
Well, and you'll see
these little spiders just leap at things.
Yeah.
So.
And you'll see with them that they have, especially I think 2 of their eyes really, really big, and they tend to all be on the front of the head, which means that they're focused forward. The same reason we have, our 2 eyes on the front of our head as opposed to on the side or on the top, is so that we can have binocular vision to judge distance, right? So, they're very cool. So he, was likening them to kittens because they pounce on their prey. The interesting thing that I found was in the article, they said that in 2013, so only 7 years ago, there were only 10 recorded species in Australia. And since then, it's gotten to 85 now. So
I think it's one of those ones where because they're small and they're secretive, you have to actually go looking for them, and you need to know what you're doing in order to look for them. Like we've got plenty of jumping spiders in our garden, but they're not the peacock variety of them. They're just the little common brown ones. But you really don't see them until you come across them and they move. Because even if they're not moving, and they tend not to panic with a thing the size of a human coming near them. If a bird flies past, I'm sure they do, but for us, they just sort of sit there, and then you might disrupt them if you're digging up under the garden or something. You disrupt them, and then they'll jump, and you go, "Oh, what was that?" So,
well, and they're very, very funny sort of creatures, right? A lot of the time, especially with these small animals, if they're not very mobile, they tend to have incredibly tiny distributions, right, of very small areas. So you have to kind of go into the thick of it, into forest, in order to find some of these species. I used to have the biggest envy of etymologists, right?
Entomologists.
I always screw this up. Etymology or
Etymologist.
entomology?
Etymology is words.
Yeah,
Entomology is insects.
I always screw that up. Anyway, so entomologists, I used to have envy of them at the museum because when we would go out and do our field trips, we would quite often put out traps and try and find our respective animals. So, for instance, my group would be the mammals group because we were studying rats. We'd try and capture all the mammals in an area and then just record which ones we found. There'd be people doing reptiles, snakes, lizards, and then there'd be people doing moths and people doing insects and other invertebrates. And almost every single time we went out, all of the guys studying things like mammals and even generally any vertebrates would come across the same old stuff that's already been described, the conspicuous larger animals.
Yeah. And you'd come across 5 of them.
Yeah, exactly. Bugger all. Whereas these guys doing the entomology stuff, so the insects or the arthropods or arachnids or whatever, they would put up nets, at night, shine a light on it, and there'd be thousands of moths and insects attracted to it. And that's probably the rest of their career. They could spend the rest of their career
exactly
with a microscope. That's
it,
describing species from just one area in the bush where they've done that. So if you guys want to get into finding new species, study insects or invertebrates. Don't study vertebrates.
No, exactly.
Although it was interesting, my supervisor, I don't know what he's up to now in terms of numbers, but when I was his student, had described 3 different genera of rats and I think at least 15 new species that were found in the forests of Indonesia. So there are still some mammals that can crop up and probably other vertebrates as well.
Oh, there'll be plenty of little reptiles in particular and amphibians that we just don't come across.
Yeah. I usually used to think that, right? When I was in the bush somewhere and you'd just be sitting there and a little insect or something would fly past you, especially those minute ones. You're reading a book and some tiny fly lands on it and you're like, I wonder if anyone's actually ever described this animal or even noticed it before, right? Because you just wonder, it's so tiny and insignificant. Has anyone paid attention to it? The next story I had was the teenager pleading guilty to a fatal punch that killed academic Stuart Williams. Did you see that story?
No, I didn't see that one.
So some 18-year-old kid drank $400 worth of spirits in a night and then fatally punched a university academic from Tasmania. So this was in Hobart. Happened last year in February. And he's just been found guilty. The guy fell down some stairs, hit his head, died 6 days later. And 6 weeks before the offence, this offender was already due in court for another attack at the same nightclub. I guess I wanted to bring it up because we see this in the news quite a bit in Australia where we have people, especially young men, with these sorts of crimes of alcohol-fueled violence. Is this something that's unique to Australia? Why is it sort of shown in Australia as such a big thing?
Well, I think it's shown in Australia as a big thing because it's not common. And it's less common now than it has been in the past. So I think that's one of the things where we are shocked, and rightly so, if somebody's been injured or in this case killed. We should be shocked, but I think we're shocked just generally in our community when we, how did that happen? Because we just don't have that level of violence in our community that many other communities have. And it's not that they accept it, but they expect it. They don't saying it's the right thing or it's a good thing, but they just expect that it's going to happen. Whereas in our case, we don't expect it's going to happen. So we make a big deal of it.
Yeah. And because we had a lot of issues, the lockout laws came through in Sydney, right? Because there was a lot of violence when people would be out drinking late at night, especially men, obviously going out into the streets and ending up in fights. And in
Melbourne.
Yeah, Melbourne as well.
And look, that was obviously a common practice. I was never a nightclub person. And back in my days when I was a teenager in early 20s, the pubs closed at 10 o'clock. And then occasionally, and then a bit later, some of them stayed open until midnight. But that thing, particularly in Melbourne and Sydney, where they're just areas with plenty of clubs and pubs in them that are open until 3 or 4 in the morning, and some of them are open 24 hours. But you're right, that lockout happened where you couldn't get into a club after 2 o'clock in the morning, even though it was still going to be open until 4 or something. So that it stopped people from bar hopping.
G'day, mate. That was the first half of this episode of The Goss. If you would like to continue watching or continue listening to this episode, make sure that you sign up for the premium podcast or academy memberships at aussieenglish.com.au, where you will get full access to these entire episodes of this series and much, much more. You can go check that out using the links below, or just go to aussieenglish.com.au. Once again, thank you so much for joining me, mate, and I will see you next time. Peace.